Thank you.
I'd be happy to respond to that question. You are right that suicide is the major problem when it comes to gun violence, and that this initiative is not necessarily directed at suicide. It is directed at taking guns away from criminals and from ensuring that criminals do not buy ammunition. I personally have some experience with suicide. Sadly, my nephew committed suicide with a gun a year ago. He was not a prohibited person. He was just a guy who was experiencing some severe stress in his life and hadn't slept for a few days and had guns because he thought they would be necessary to protect his family. Instead, as is so often the case, he ended up using the gun on himself in a moment of desperation. You're also correct that gun violence has dropped by 56% nationwide, but gun violence has dropped twice as fast here in California in the last 20 years. And that is due in large part, because of the 50 strong gun laws that the legislature has adopted in that time period.
Okay, then we agree. Gun violence has gone down in California significantly because of the laws that are already in place. So my question to you then is it your intent to reduce gun violence to zero? Because that's not going to happen. So if we've already reduced it by more than half, and the number of suicides have gone up, the number of murders have gone down, what are you trying to do here?
The numbers are still unacceptably high, even though they have gone down. Too many people are dying from gun-related injuries. So, no law is a panacea. No group of laws is a panacea. We are not saying that if Californians go to the ballot in November and vote for this law and it passes, that our gun violence problem will disappear. You're right, that's not going to happen, but we must try. We must try to do something.
Okay, and I agree with you, but this isn't going to solve the problem. I mean, and one of the opponents brought up a very good point in that if I purchase a gun and that stays with me, I don't get rid of it, I don't sell it, I don't destroy it, but I keep purchasing ammunition for that gun, which is going to go into this database that has been proposed. So over time, then it starts to look like I'm stockpiling ammunition, and then what happens? I mean, I don't think that that's your intent. I get that, I understand your intent, I don't agree with it, I understand your intent, but I think you're creating another problem within this process for people like me or anyone else who's just an average, gun-owning person, and
is that your?
I don't want to take up all the time, but I just want to make sure that this is on the record, that I don't believe that this initiative is going to solve the problem of gun violence that some have suggested we have. I think we have more of a mental health issue that we need to discuss more so than an ammunition problem. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for your brief and concise question. Anyone else have any?
I'm happy to address this to either opponents or proponents. In states that have stronger gun safety laws, do we see any correlation with reduced use of firearms in suicides?
Yes. In a word, yes. My background is in suicide policy in the VA and in the veterans community, and the data is out there that non-firearm suicides are roughly equal across 50 states. About the 10 states with the highest rates of firearm ownership and easiest access to firearms by mentally ill individuals have about twice the rate of firearm suicide, and as a result, significantly larger suicide problems.
Please.
I think also if you would. Are we on? Okay. Actually, if you look at Australia, which has essentially owned private handgun ownership, if you look at, they just hit a 10-year high in their suicide rates. And they've banned guns dating back, I mean, we're talking decades. So the issue is, and I think that this is what the Assemblyman was bringing up, we're focusing in a lot of these laws, in this case, on the tools. The fact is yes, we have a suicide problem. Yes, we have a violence problem. And our focus is And the focus of this legislation is, let's focus on the tool of that violence, and let's not instead of focusing on the cause of that violence.
Mr. Chair, if I might,
Yes.
Mr. Freilich, if there's a response to the comment with regard to Australia, if you have any information.
I'm not familiar with the data about Australia. I just know about the United States' data, but I can share that we have a different view. We don't think it's an either or. If we wanted to address drunk driving, we wouldn't just address a problem with alcohol or the root causes of alcoholism. We would also pass laws to make drunk driving behavior illegal. And that's what we're trying to, you define responsible behavior by enacting laws.
Thank you.
Mr. Glazer, you had a question?
I would just ask either the proponents or the opponents if they have any data on how many of these ammunition clips exceeding 10 rounds are in circulation in California.
I could respond to that. We don't. That's part of the problem. As Mr. Freilich noted previously, large capacity ammunition magazines don't contain serial numbers or any identifying marks, so there's no way to grandfather them in, even if we wanted to, the way assault weapons were grandfathered in. So nobody knows. And that's why the LA example isn't very persuasive either, because we don't know how many people in LA had these magazines to begin with. Also because they don't have to just turn them into law enforcement. They could have sold them to a firearms dealer or removed them from the state. So we do not know what's happened in LA after the local law was passed.
There you go. And I think more to the point is we don't know how many people in lawful possession of those magazines right now either. How many people we're talking about who've had these for all this time, who have possessed them legally, who have used them for recreational purposes. How many people are those who are going to be affected by this versus what we're trying to do here and what we're trying to stop?
I think it's also important to note that, it was recommended by the proponents that they could sell it to a firearms dealer. There is no market for used standard capacity magazines in a state where the dealer can't sell them. There is no market. Who's the dealer then going to turn around and sell them to? Why would they purchase them if they have no ability to sell them?
Okay, thank you. You have questions?
Thank you. Yeah, I do. I'm just interested in the confiscation issue that was raised, or the taking issue. And what Mr. Deleuze just said made me think that there may not be a monetary value to these things. How do you take some, you can regulate something. I just wondered if there's any case law on the takings issue.
First, with the idea that the government is confiscating people's magazines or taking them, that's just not the case. They aren't being taken because people do have the option of taking them out of the state or of selling them to a firearms dealer. I don't know what the fair market value of a magazine is, but it does retain some economic value. But moreover, the government is actually allowed to take or to confiscate property where that property threatens public safety. There's a distinction between cases where a government regulation is intended to protect the public versus the situation where the government is actually acquiring property for its own use. For example, when the government takes somebody's home and has to pay that person because they're putting a freeway through the person's yard. Those are completely different situations. So technically there is legally no taking under this scenario.
Do you know what the status is? I believe that both Sunnyvale and San Francisco enacted prohibitions on high-capacity magazines. Are those cases in the court right now?
The Ninth Circuit did consider a challenge to the Sunnyvale law, and it upheld the law. It said that it did not violate the Second Amendment, and that as the Heller Court, the Supreme Court determined in 2008, the Second Amendment guarantees the right of law-abiding, responsible individuals to possess a handgun in the home for self-defense. You do not have to have a magazine capable of holding 100 rounds of ammunition to defend yourself in the home. So the court held that it was a valid law and rejected the Second Amendment challenge.
If I might note, we keep using the term high-capacity magazine. The reality is in most cases, what we're talking about are standard capacity magazines that are issued with these firearms, ranging between 15 to 30 rounds. The example of the 100 drum or the 100 round magazine, first of all, is the exception for anybody purchasing magazines, and would probably be in a small minority of those high capacity magazines that are actually in existence in the state of California.
Yes, the 10 round is not an industry standard. There's no agreement that this was going to be the amount. This was arbitrarily determined by this legislature back when this was decided. If it was 9, if it was 12, 10 is a nice round number, and that's appears to be what they stuck with, but for no other reason. The underlying concern is, of course, then you have people in lawful possession with these, and they continue to be in lawful possession well until we decide to change the laws. And then those lawful owners then all of a sudden become criminals and subject to prosecution.
Again, just a question on that. Is there a capacity after which you would consider something a high-capacity magazine that has no hunting purpose or home protection purpose? And I'm just thinking that I believe it was a 34-round capacity magazine that killed all the people in San Bernardino. Would you agree that that's high capacity? Maybe 10 was the wrong number? What's the feeling?
I think you're trying to limit to the point where what is capacity and what is going to be an actual standard capacity or whatever's preferred capacity for an individual is really going to be up to that individual's interests, what their desires are, and what their needs are. I may not need a 10-round magazine to defend myself. Someone who has a difficult time loading and unloading ammunition into a firearm may need something bigger, depending on whether or not there's an issue with concerning age or in frailty and their ability to change magazines. And so what you're essentially asking me is how can I, for everybody out there who needs to make an individual decision of what capacity magazine, what they potentially may need for themselves, what that capacity should be. And I'm sorry, Senator, I can't do that.
Okay, thank you. So there is no definition except one that we arbitrarily take. Okay, thank you. Just another, this is to both the proponents and opponents. I tried to follow the statistics. I find them very interesting. I don't think I was able to do that with all the different statistics that came out. I think if any of you just have a sheet with what the statistics are. Handguns, homicides, suicides. I'm interested also in the statistics with other states and nations in terms of what we mean when we say there's an epidemic of gun violence in this country as opposed to other countries. And I would just welcome any of your statistics if you can give them to me to share with the committee. I do want to just briefly comment that one thing that struck me in the conversation is, you know, if we're talking about creating a new class of criminals, that's kind of what the Public Safety Committee does a lot. We try to either cut back on penalties on the theory that we have public health issues connected with drug use and other things that may make it not appropriate for a criminal sentence. And we're often told not to do that because laws have a deterrent effect that's important. Sentence enhancements, all those things come to us for that reason. I think the suggestion that we have mental health issues connected with these things, and there could be other approaches, is an interesting one. And I think we're all trying to find a balance between the deterrent effect of laws for law-abiding people and public health, mental health issues connected with harm that's done to people. So I look forward to continuing that discussion with everybody here, regardless of the outcome of the initiative or the legislation that's pending. And just to say that, a number of senators did go to Norway last year. In Norway, they have very few gun laws and very little gun violence. They also have a prison system based on rehabilitation, not punishment. And they have a 20% recidivism rate as opposed to ours 60% plus. So there are probably many things we can learn and possibly do together in this, regardless of what happens with this particular initiative or legislation. But I thank you all very much for coming, and I think we've learned a lot. And if you could submit some of your information to us, we could go over it and probably learn a lot more.
I just want to echo everything the Chair of Public Safety on the Senate side said. And I will tell you, I've been here 3 years, almost 4, and I've heard this discussion about mental health, and I've not seen really any legislation on both the opponent or the proponent side to really deal with that. And I think this legislature should really delve into it seriously, even if I have to write some legislation to actually get the ball rolling, because you're absolutely right. We need to do something about the mental health of people who have possession of guns, and we need to stop talking about it and start doing something. And so I'll push that. As far as what we have on the table and what we're discussing now, it's just interesting to me that we not only have an initiative, but I think we have, I'll call them companion legislation, because I don't want to couch one is better than the other, whether it's looking at ammunition sales, ammunition regulation, but we also have the De Leon bill, which also looks at that. Whether you're looking at lost and stolen guns, I believe AB's 1695 Bonta bill. We also have a Jackson bill that also addresses it. And I think they're not opposed to one another, but they may have also helped strengthen it, or may even make it a better solution for what we ultimately want to do. And so we will be having, obviously within the legislature, some discussions on how we can move all of this forward, including the gun theft laws and even the ghost guns and bullet button, is to have a comprehensive discussion on what really makes sense moving forward. Obviously getting cooperation for all branches. That's not only the Senate, the Assembly, but even the governor, to have those discussions so that we come up with something that we all believe is the best way moving forward. And so it was really important for me to get information today, because it'll help me formulate how we move forward on the legislative side. Obviously, the initiative side will move independent of us, but it'll be interesting to see how we can hopefully marry it a lot better so that we can move forward. So I also want to thank everyone for coming here today. Is there any other? That's it.
The hearing is adjourned.